On my recent trip to Hawaii, I had a unique opportunity to talk to the Canon product development team. That's the actual people and the engineers from Japan who designed the PowerShot V1 and the R50V and all of the cameras and lenses that you and I use. And they had some interesting questions for me, and I also shared a bunch of features and my personal wish list of about 4 items and 1 lens in particular that I would really love to see implemented on the Canon EOS-R system. So I can tell you that they'll probably end up watching this video, or at least some of the USA team will. So if you have any features that you want to see in a Canon camera, leave them down below and hopefully they'll read and give the ones that you like a thumbs up, and we'll all maybe collaborate on a feature list together. But the first one that I brought up, now all of these new cameras that are coming out, the PowerShot V1 and the R50V, have C-Log 3, which is a log color profile that kind of looks flat. If you don't know what that is, you can go in and you can set the custom picture styles in all of these cameras, and in the R5 Mark II. Now the R5 Mark II has C-Log 2 versus C-Log 3. And I brought up to them that C-Log 2 is a better color profile. And I know it has to relate to the ability of the sensor to read out that much information, dynamic range, and all that technical stuff. But even if a camera can't handle it technically, and it's not perfect in the way that a cinema EOS camera would, it would be great to have C-Log 2 across the entire line of Canon cameras, or at least the future cameras that are coming out. Like the R6 Mark III, whenever that future camera comes out, it needs to have C-Log 2 so that I can match the footage from one camera to the next. Now I can do that with C-Log 3, but if I'm someone who has C-Log 2 in an R5 Mark II or in my R1, it would be really awesome if I could pick up one of these new V series camera, V for video, and have C-Log 2. Again, even if it isn't perfect. One of the new features that was added, or I guess you could say finally added to the Canon R50V, was the digital level now stays on when you record. So even with the R5 Mark II, when I hit record on this camera, the digital level, that kind of indicator of whether or not my camera is perfectly horizontal and vertically straight, that stays on, which is huge for video shooters, because if you're moving around and you're kind of maybe swaying a little bit, you don't want your footage to go crooked. You want it to be as level as possible. Now, I think that is something that we should be able to fix with firmware, retroactively add it to the Canon R5 Mark II and the R6 Mark II and all of those higher end cameras. The fact that there are now a ton of new features in these lower end, I don't want to call it lower end, but these less expensive cameras that aren't in these newer cameras absolutely kills me. Do I need to wait for an R5 Mark III to get digital level? Hopefully not. Hopefully that's something that they can add through firmware. So I had about 2 hours, I think, where I was sitting down at dinner with some of the Japan Canon Inc. development team, and they had a lot of questions for us about lenses, about features. One of the things that was kind of talked about was screen technology, because I think most of these cameras now have LCD technology, if I'm not mistaken. We haven't quite moved to OLED or LED technology. And so the idea of HDR was brought up. And I'm not talking about HDR compositing with photos. I'm talking about HDR display. A lot of phones, like your iPhone and your Google Pixel and your Samsung, have the ability to display a larger dynamic range image using kind of the localized brightness of those individual LEDs in an LED screen. Needless to say, what it means is raw photos, the raw files that your camera takes, have a larger dynamic range than a standard dynamic range screen. And so, is that something we want to see in a camera? I think it's kind of hit or miss. Personally, for me, I would rather see other things improved, like a better tilt swivel screen. I was actually sitting at the table with Jared Poland, who one of the things he always complains about is the fact that the Canon screens aren't perfectly level when you flip them out. And honestly, it never bothered me until he brought it up. So maybe Canon fix that before you give us HDR screens. But I think it would be cool, because right now, as far as I know, none of the other camera brands have HDR rear screens. But one of the features that I brought up as being super important to me, kind of as like a hybrid shooter, is open gate. And I kind of got a little bit of pushback from the Canon Japan people, and they said, well, would you actually use that? And I think the reason they asked me, or kind of like pushback, was that because when we talk about open gate, it often has to do with filming vertical and horizontal content, where you can use the full height of the sensor so that if you want to recrop or reframe later, you can. But for a lot of video shooters, open gate is important if you have anamorphic lenses, so that you have a little bit of extra height, that when the image gets squeezed and you de-squeeze it, you just have more pixels and more resolution to work with. So I could see maybe why Canon hasn't given us that feature yet, because maybe the discussion just needs to be reframed differently. And you gotta think of it from a technical standpoint, that anytime a new camera comes out or they're doing firmware updates, there's only so much R&D, like research and development budget, that they can put towards new features. And so if not a lot of people want or would use OpenGate, then they're probably gonna focus on other things like AI functionality, which also came up at the discussion. And I think one of the things I mentioned is that the original R5 had a pixel stitch mode where you could like sensor shift, IBIS shift, and get a higher resolution image. Mind you, it was JPEG, and I brought that up to them. I said, hey, like, what happened to this feature? I thought this feature was cool, but maybe just give it to us in like a raw photo format. So take what was on the R5, put it on the R5 II, but give us like raw stitched high resolution photos. Now, a lot of other cameras have it and are implementing it and are keeping that feature, but Canon opted to go the AI route, where now we have AI upscaling inside the camera, which again, is not something that I would use. So it was interesting to me when this camera came out that they put R&D budget towards a feature like that. But I'm sure some of you out there would love that feature and would use it. It's just not a feature that I'm using. So I was at the table with Jared, Poland, and Irene, and a few others, and one of the features that Irene brought up was having more crop ability inside of your camera. So having, with the R6 II, they implemented a feature where you can have like a overlay mode where you can see like the vertical 16:9. And one of the features that she had asked for was having even more options. So maybe if you want to do like a 1x1 or a 4x5. Now, of course, with raw photos, that's not baked in. With JPEGs, the crop is baked in, but with raw photos, you can, add a crop and then uncrop it later. But if you're someone who's creating content for social media or for Instagram, that would definitely be useful. Now, that's a feature that we've seen implemented on Fujifilm cameras with the recent GFX 100 RF. There's literally a dial on the camera that allows you to scroll through all the different crop modes. And personally, having used that camera, I did find it was something that was fun. I don't know if a more professional, like an R5 II or an R1 user would want it, but I could definitely see it being implemented in something that's maybe more an entry-level camera, like an R50, or maybe like a mid-tier camera, like an R7 or an R8. Speaking of the R50V, this is a very interesting camera. And if you haven't watched my last video, I kind of gave a first view initial impressions of what this camera is all about. So I'll link that up here. But they had a lot of questions about what I thought about this camera. And I brought up the fact that I think this is a camera a lot of us have been waiting for. A lot of us have looked at what Sony has to offer in their like ZV lineup and their FX3 lineup. And while this isn't quite an FX3 in terms of who it's intended for, maybe it's a little bit more for like that ZV vlogging, video, content creation type shooter. It's very interesting to see a form factor that gets rid of the viewfinder. Now, crop sensor maybe isn't for me because 90% of the lenses that I have are full frame. So I actually brought up to Canon, hey, I like this format with the no viewfinder and the button on the front and the more video-centric dial that you have with the mode dial here. And typically when I'm out shooting, I will take two cameras with me. Right now I'm taking the R5 and the R5 II. One I'll use for video and the other I'll use for photo. But with the one that I'm using for video, I'm doing a lot of just handheld video recording. I'm vlogging. I'm not using the viewfinder because I'm vlogging like this, where I'm flipping it out and I'm watching myself in the screen. Or I'm kind of like hand holding it and taking videos of other people. So to kind of like chop off that viewfinder and give me a more squared off design that's more compact means I can bring another camera with me and be able to fit more gear. And I know that's, maybe seems very minimal, like just keep the viewfinder, Anthony. Like, is it really that big of a deal? But yes, depending on where you're traveling to and how much space and everything you're trying to fit, having a more compact form factor means you can fit a camera cage on it easier, or you can have more mounting points like what they now have on the vertical mounting point, where there's now a 1/4-20, and you can tripod mount it vertically. So all of that to say, I love this camera. I think it's awesome. I think there's a user for it. But because I'm a full frame shooter, I would love to see an R50V that's full frame. So whether it's an R6 II, that's maybe like an R6V, or an R5V that uses a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, I would absolutely love. So I told Canon that. They kind of like gave me a little bit of a smirk when I said it, or maybe I just imagined it because I'm projecting what I want in terms of products. But if I had to guess, I'd say Canon is probably working on something that is a full frame version of this. And again, the V series, this is kind of like a new iteration of cameras where it sits in between the EOS R mirrorless cameras that are photography centric and the cinema series that is video production broadcast. The V series is somewhere in between. So I do expect us to see more cameras in this lineup. Again, I don't know anything. That's just me speculating and personally what I'd love to see. There was a lot of talk about lenses at that dinner table, and in particular about unique lenses like f2 lenses and lenses with power zoom functionality, because the R50V now has power zoom. So it's not just something that you get in high-end cameras, you get them in the more entry beginner-friendly cameras as well. And I brought up the fact that the 15-35, the wide angle lens, is the lens that I use the most. And I got asked, well, would you want a power zoom lens with that wide angle, ultra wide angle option? And the answer for me is probably not, but looking at what Canon has done with the 70-200 that is the power zoom, and the 24-105 that has that power zoom functionality, my guess is that one of the next lenses that they'll implement will be a wide angle power zoom. Looking at what Sony just released with the 50-150 f2, if I had to guess, I would say Canon also has one in the works, but that's not something that we talked about. Another lens that's kind of like missing in the lineup is a 35 f1.2. We don't have one of those yet. And also, being selfish, I would love to see an updated version of the 50mm f1.2, which is one of the first RF lenses ever. I've compared that lens to the Sony equivalent and do find the Canon to be a little bit slower. Although it looks great optically, I would like something with faster linear autofocus motors. But the one lens that is missing from Canon's lineup that is very much needed is an ultra wide, low aperture prime lens. So something like Sony's 14mm f1.4 that is good for low light, that's ultra wide, or if you're into astrophotography, is kind of like that holy grail of astrophotography lenses. And I don't even care if it's an f1.8. Give me an f1.8. But there is a massive difference between the f2.8, the 15-35 that I'm filming on now, because that is a lens that I'll use for astro, and something that is an f1.8 or an f1.4. Now, we brought up the VCM lenses, kind of like that new 20mm f1.4, and we kind of collectively agreed at the table that the optical distortion and the vignetting on those lenses isn't great for low light. The optical correction distortion, that's fine, but it's the vignetting that makes it harder to correct for, because it ends up having more noise in the corners when you're shooting in the dark or in low light. So the 20mm doesn't work for me. I need something that is optically superior, or like optically corrected with optical elements that I can go out and shoot images of the sky and have that low aperture, because it honestly means the difference between doing something like a 20 or a 30-second exposure at f2.8 and doing like a 10-second exposure at an f1.8 or an f1.4. But I know that's a little bit niche and maybe not a lens for everyone, so let me know what lenses you'd like to see from Canon in the future, down in the comments below. But that's it for my kind of wish list of Canon items that I'd love to see in some future cameras and in some future lenses. If there's anything I missed, anything I agree with, or maybe anything you disagree with, let me know down in the comments below. And stay tuned for next week's video, because it's probably gonna be one around the PowerShot V1 and a photo shoot that I did with this camera while we were in Hawaii. So thanks for watching, and until the next one, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos.